Princeton AlumniCorps, which is a nonprofit organization made up of, by, and for Princeton alumni, really. It was started by the amazing class of 1955 when they were 55 years old, and was originally known as Project 55. And a couple of years ago, after the class of 55 members had made a decision that they didn't want this amazing organization to fade off into the sunset as there became fewer and fewer of them, they decided to make it a self-perpetuating organization. And as the third president of the organization, who was not from the class of 55, I think it shows that we have actually really put money where mouth was in doing that. And so it is now a really vibrant organization that includes volunteers from probably almost every class since 1955 to the present. And the work that we do is all related to getting Princetonians engaged in civic leadership. And that takes any number of definitions. I think probably amongst the board we all have our own. But we have a common thread of really wanting to find work that we can do together that will help to solve some of the gnarly problems that exist in our world today, as well as helping to prepare a future generation of leaders who will engage in that same kind of work, whether they make it their life's work professionally or whether they make it an avocation that they do as a volunteer effort. And we have people involved who do both. Our core programs at this point are the Princeton Project 55 Fellowships, which have been in existence for over 20 years, where we place approximately 5% of every Princeton graduating class in fellowship opportunities that last for 1 to 2 years in nonprofits or government agencies. And it's been a transformative experience for a number of those fellows who have really changed their life's path based on their fellowship experience. In the past couple of years, we've started 2 new programs. One called Community Volunteers, where we are seeking to match up alumni who have work-hand life experience and want to donate some time and energy to nonprofits who have needs for pro bono consulting or board members or other volunteer activity. And the second is called Emerging Leaders, where we're, again, looking to take a young generation of folks, probably 6 to 8, maybe 10 years out of college, who are on a nonprofit leadership track and really want to develop their leadership skills and talent and get some mentoring and some hard education on how to move that forward. We operate nationally in a multitude of cities, and we would like to expand beyond the ones we're in. I'll let you go to our website for all of the details on where we are and what we're doing in those sites. And I really just wanted to open up and thank you for coming. I'm hoping we will not only get you interested in today's topic, which is one that we've been involved in for many, many years. This particular panel has, in a variety of iterations, happened in New York City over a number of years with the New York City Fellows and the New York DA's office. And we're delighted to have it on the road here on campus. And so I'm hoping you'll look at our website, get interested, find something that you can do with us. And I am now going to turn it over to Rainah, who is going to give you introduction of our panelists and a little bit more about what we're doing today. And so thank you for coming. And you'll see a few of us with Ask Me About AlumniCorps buttons. Feel free to do so.
Hi everyone, thank you Kathy. My name is Rainah Berlowitz, class of 97. And I was a Princeton AlumniCorps fellow way back in 1997. And I believe I still hold the record for longest continued sustained placement at an agency. Education Through Music was where I was placed. We help restore music education in schools, mainly New York City, but we recently opened affiliates in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And in my role as a civic leader, I'm trying to take that across the country, wherever it's needed. I'm really grateful to AlumniCorps for all the support and help, certainly in the original placement. When I was a senior, I really had no idea what I would do with my great talent. And suddenly a need arose, and a relationship was built between me and this organization, and I found I connected with the cause, connected with the leadership, and certainly it's transformed my life. One of the things that I really enjoyed about AlumniCorps was having a mentor who actually helped me deal with a drug dealer who was bothering me my first year. Welcome to your city. I learned the words, you don't know me, leave me alone. That was my way of coping with my year there. That stopped, and actually we'll get into some of the reasons why that may have decreased in general. I became a mentor a couple of years after, and I wanted a particular mentee of mine, Cameron Snaith, who founded yet another nonprofit called Giving Opportunities to Others, which raises money for scholarships and also encourages young professionals to be involved in philanthropy. And that organization is still around today, and I'm still a volunteer, actually. I'm the chairman of the board. So I want everyone sort of realize the sort of alumni core ethos is something that continues to grow, and the leadership that it's supporting to build has been built, and it's actually rather stunning the way to have seen it grow. One of the other, the final thing that I really enjoyed about being a fellow was the seminar series. And one of the best seminar series was the one on criminal justice, featuring our speakers to the left of me. I would like to quickly introduce Peter Kougasian. Peter has served as a Manhattan District Attorney for more than 30 years, currently serving as a special assistant in the Office of the Special Narcotics Prosecutor. Some other things that are not in his bio. He was actually planning to be a criminal defense attorney until he met legendary Manhattan DA Robert Morgenthau. And finally, two keywords if you Google Peter. The first one is lawyer, and the second one is magician. Robert Steinberg, Executive Director of the Bronx Defenders, also its founder. Career public defender, advocating for holistic representation and the community defender movement. She's been honored by the National Legal Aid and Defender Association and the New York Bar Association as a leader and pioneer in the field of indigent defense. Before we get started with our topics, I wanted to get sort of, by show of hands, we talked a little bit about some primary topics that we talked about. So I will, by show of hands, show your interest. Police brutality. A lot of interest in that topic. War on drugs. Stop and frisk. A lot of people know what that is. Jury nullification. That a feeling.
My best materials on jury nullification.
We'll definitely get to that. Well, before we move into those specific topics, I would like to offer Peter and Robin a chance to talk a little bit more about their work and tell us their views on the role of the justice system. Robin?
All right, so one of the, first I'm supposed to say I'm delighted to be here. I am not a Princeton grad, but Scott Levy just walked in, who's a Princeton grad and works in my office. So thank you, Scott, because I was beginning to feel a little bit concerned here. So, you know, one of the things they asked us in the phone call leading up to this panel was to talk a little bit about what the goals of the criminal justice system are. And I have to be honest, as somebody who's been a public defender since 1982, that would be 30 years, I began to sort of sit back last night and think, what are the goals of the criminal justice system? Like, you kind of lose it once you're in it. And so I decided to do a little bit of research and sort of see what do the people out there like define as the goals of the criminal justice system. And so what I found was that actually the goals are defined largely by the United States criminal justice policy has been guided by a 1967 President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, which actually defined the goals back then. And pretty much we have supposedly been guided by those goals since then. So they define the goal as the criminal justice system is the means for society to enforce the standards of conduct necessary to protect individuals and the community. And so I read it and I took it in and I thought, well, that sounds like a really good goal, I guess. And then I reflected upon the past 30 years of my experience. And I thought to myself, that is so not the goal of the criminal justice system in the United States of America. Like, maybe it was back then, I don't know, I was only 10. But it certainly isn't the goal now. And how would I describe what the goal of the criminal justice system is now? And I have to say that I think it has shifted dramatically. Maybe it was always the goal, and I just don't know. But I will tell you that after 30 years toiling in the criminal justice system in lots of different jurisdictions and lots of different offices, doing the work of public defense in lots of different ways, I kind of have settled on the idea that the goal of the criminal justice system as it exists today is to use the web of connected networks and institutions that make up the criminal justice system to exercise legal, social, and economic control over a group of people who are largely defined by race and class in the society. And that's unfortunately what I actually think the goal of the criminal justice system is. What I actually think it is meant to do at this point, at this moment in history, is to throw a wide net over poor communities of color and to maintain social and political and economic control over those communities and to create, quite frankly, a subclass within America that looks very much like a racial caste system. And that's what I think the criminal justice system does. That's what I think its goal is. Do I think that's intentional? Do I think people sat down and consciously thought that's what it was going to be? No. But do I think that it has turned into that and it is used for that at all levels, both the legislative level, at the court level, and at the punishment sanction level? I think it is used for all of those nefarious reasons. And that's what I think its goal is, and I can talk about why and what support I have for that, but that's what I think the goal of the criminal justice system is at this moment in time.
Rainah made reference earlier to the event that changed me from wanting to be a defense attorney to wanting to be a prosecutor. And really it was a question that was asked. I was at a law school conference on what to do with your life when I was in law school, and Robert Morgenthau was on the panel, and one of the students asked the impertinent question, how can you enjoy putting people in jail for a living? And his answer was, the answer was wonderful because he never answered the question. He answered the question that I think motivated the question. He said, never forget that the people who are victims of crimes are disproportionately poor, minorities, and disenfranchised. Never think that by being a prosecutor, you're championing one set of class interests at the expense of another. He said, in fact, the fair administration of the criminal laws gives the only hope that many people have to leading a meaningful life. And look, I didn't know if that answer was right or wrong, but I said, this is a guy I want to work for. When I started, you'll see Robin has many ways of subtly reminding us that I'm older than she is. But when I started in the criminal justice system and moved to New York for the first time, it was a much, much different city from the city that you see now when you go to New York, and probably much different from almost any city that you see when you go around the industrialized world. It was a city, it was a part of a country, an urban environment where violent crime was at an all-time high and increasing every year. And that had tremendous effect on the way people thought about their city, their lives, and about their government. You saw serious commentators saying that the Constitution had outlived its usefulness, that the rights that were guaranteed for individuals had become unworkable in the lawless communities of New York. There were those who said that there was a whole generation of young people that were lost and were beyond redemption. The word super predator was invented by a professor at this university. And he said that these were super predators who would only get worse and worse, and the only thing society could do was put them away forever at an early age, because if you waited too long, our cities would be destroyed. Well, what has happened? What happened was, in New York, I would argue, some enlightened people did not see their job that way. Among them, that man who convinced me to become a prosecutor. Something called smart policing took over to try to prevent crimes before they were committed. And so, let me just tell you the bottom line. Today, crime in New York is one of the safest big cities in America. Homicides in Manhattan are below any rate ever measured in modern times, and of the 50 largest metropolitan areas in New York ranks 47th in the size of its jail population. Now that's a win-win if ever there was one. So, people walk the streets of New York without, I think, worrying about getting mugged or even losing their life. People have more of a sense of control over their own destiny. I don't think most people realize that that represents a real revolution. And so I would argue that it is trying to provide security for the people while defending individual rights. Striking that balance is the role of the criminal justice system, and largely the role of an enlightened prosecutor.
Hey, you want us to just keep on going?
No, she's
I'm happy to keep on going with that.
I was actually
she's best when she attacks me, so.
That's because I'm younger than you are. So, it's an interesting question, right? If you believe that the goals of the criminal justice system are actually to, in fact, protect society and protect all residents of our community, then you would imagine that as crime has fallen and fallen and fallen, decade after decade after decade in New York City, what you would expect to see is arrest rates to fall and fall and fall and fall, right? Guess what? They haven't fallen. Arrest numbers are at an all-time high in New York City. So you have to sort of say, well, I don't get it. If there's no crime or little crime, or as Peter says himself, very little violent crime going on in New York City, and by the way, it's important to note, that trend is nationwide. That trend is from one end of the country to the other end of the country, north, south, east, and west. So we can talk about policing and whether it's the New York City policing miracle that actually brought that change about, but I would submit to you if it's happened across the country, in every state of the union, that you could actually ask a question. Something else is at play here, and it's not necessarily the Ray Kelly policing strategy of stopping every person of color on the street and searching them. If you look at the numbers, you can really ask yourself, sort of, well, if crime's gone down, why do arrests keep going up? And why are the overwhelming majority of people in the criminal justice system from poor communities, and in New York City that means largely communities of color? And if crime is actually going down, you would expect to see fewer prosecutors, fewer defenders, fewer courtrooms, fewer judges, right? Things winding down, and they don't wind down. The arrests keep happening and happening and happening, and creating stigma of a criminal conviction continues to happen and happen and happen. And now what's it for? It's for minor misdemeanors, overwhelmingly nonviolent, overwhelmingly, by the way, victimless crimes. Now, he's going to say drugs are victim crimes, and if you sell at a schoolyard, it's a victim. But you know what I'm talking about when we say victims. The image of there's a robbery, there's a murder, there's a rape. In New York City last year, there were 536 murders. Now, I feel badly for the 536 people that were killed and for their families and for the people that suffer. But it is an infinitesimal fraction of what's going on in the criminal justice system. What's really going on in the criminal justice system is poor people from poor communities of color around New York City are being rounded up and arrested for serious crimes like marijuana possession, trespass, jumping turnstiles, property crimes, the kinds of things that actually then brand people with records, make it almost impossible for them to move forward in society, prevent them from getting jobs, have all sorts of collateral consequences from losing housing, losing federal financial aid, getting deported, losing your children, breaking up your family. It has those kinds of ramifications, and that's if you're lucky enough not to go to jail, right? And we're creating entire communities filled with people who are forever stigmatized and are going to be prevented in lots of ways from moving forward out of a caste system that I believe has largely been created by the criminal justice system and maintained by it. So we can talk about, becoming a prosecutor because what you want to do is protect victims, and more victims are poor people of color than they are other people. It's a tiny little fraction of who's being arrested and what the crimes are and what people are charged with in the criminal justice system. And it's important to remember that most people coming through the criminal justice system are poor, almost all, the state criminal justice system. In urban areas, they are almost all people of color. And that, in fact, they don't even reflect where crime really is happening. And that's really interesting to me. And that's why when I say what I think the goals of the criminal justice system are, I think there's support for it. And you can take, as a great example, a marijuana arrest in New York City. It's a simple thing to take because nobody will get hysterical about it. It's marijuana. You can agree, you can disagree, it should be legal, but nobody actually gets all worked up about it. So you can look at it through a clear lens, right, without the hysteria of, oh my God, somebody's going to get robbed, right? And if you look at marijuana, what you realize in New York City is all social scientists hands down agree that the largest pot possessors and users in urban areas are white people. There's no research that indicates anything other than more white people use marijuana than people of color. And that class is utterly irrelevant, okay? But what you see is, of the 50,000 arrests that were made in New York City last year for marijuana, yes, 50,000 people were put in a cage for marijuana last year. Of those 50,000 people that were arrested, 80% of them were young Black and Latino men. Despite the fact that we know across New York City, it is actually white, affluent, non-affluent people who possess and use marijuana at a much higher rate. And by the way, there's no gender distinction. So there's even a gender bias in the arrest. That's a whole different conversation left for women's studies class. So it's a very troubling statistic to think about, right? And when you're thinking about what's the point of the criminal justice system, I think it's this incredible microcosm of what are we actually using the criminal justice system for? And how is it possible that if marijuana use is that prevalent amongst white young people, that the only people you see in the criminal justice system, or 80% of them, are Black and Latino young men? And that's when you begin to really ask yourself the hard questions about what's going on here. What does that say about policing? What does it say about how we define crime? What does it say about what the stigma is that gets attached when you come to the system and the barriers that it creates for people to move forward and actually get education and get jobs down in the future? And what is the justice system being used for? And I think it's an example of the ways in which the criminal justice system is being used to actually create a subordinate class.
Well, with respect to the criminal justice statistics, at Robert Morgenthau's farewell party after he'd been district attorney for 35 years, he mentioned that not only had crime dropped dramatically in New York, but he pointed out that among the 5 boroughs, crime in Manhattan was a success story within a success story, that from being #1 in murders, it was now next to Staten Island in the lowest number of murders. And he pointed out, I've never mentioned this in public before, because only now am I retiring, and I was afraid the numbers were going to go up. You know, I guess if I had to tell you why the numbers have gone down so dramatically nationwide, I think Robin is in no small part right, that it's a much larger phenomenon than New York. When I was here at Princeton doing quantitative research in crime patterns, the common belief back then was that you could predict the level of violent crime based on one statistic: the level of the percentage of young men in society. As the baby boom years went along, and as the percentage of young men in society increased, crime increased along with it. When that figure dropped historically, the violent crime figure would drop. What changed all that were the crack years of the early 1980s. That's when we started to see the young male population decrease and crime rates soar. And that's because this remarkable drug that was very readily available, very cheap, and that not only devastated the individual but destroyed communities. As I often point out, epidemiologists were stunned that AIDS was spreading through the crack-using community. They couldn't understand this because crack is not injected. They didn't see the mechanism of transmission. Well, it turned out what they discovered was that young women who were deep in the throes of crack addiction would, in order to get their next fix, offer casual sex on such a prominent basis that it became itself a risk factor for transmitting AIDS. Now, I mention that because, to some extent, the decrease in crime nationwide might simply be seen as something that might have been predicted based upon the fact that eventually the young male population decreases and crime rates go down. But for heaven's sakes, New York used to be one of the most dangerous cities in America. Now it is one of the safest. And so, you know, criminologists point out that there was so much crime in New York. Think about this. At the height of violent crime in America, there were maybe 10,000 murders in America. 2,000 of those were in New York. So understand that when New York goes from 2,000 murders down to 600, that's not just a huge percentage drop in New York. It's a big percentage drop for the whole nation based only on what's happening in New York. In other words, if the whole rest of America had exactly the same number of murders, the big story for America would be crime drops dramatically in America. Why? Because crime drops so dramatically in New York. And look, I think we have to say that whatever the demographics are of violent crime, a large part of what's happened is smart policing. And what does that mean? Well, part of smart, and look, smart policing, you know, like anything, can go too far. And I bet you that pretty soon Rob and I would be on the same side when we look at some of the excesses of some of these policies. But by and large, I'm on the side of smart policing. And what does it mean? It means that, for example, if you have Bryant Park, beautiful park near in Midtown Manhattan, right near the public library, that for a while was so overloaded with drug dealers that one day Robert Morgenthau walked the steps of the public library and several times was offered drugs on his way up the steps by drug dealers. Now, those might have been A, misdemeanors. But if you have a park that is that overrun by drug dealers and drug users, then families are not going to go there, people are not going to enjoy their lunch there, and what happens is neighborhoods get destroyed. So you say, why is it, Peter, you're talking about reducing murders, but all of these people with relatively low-level crimes, perhaps even misdemeanors, are getting arrested? Well, part of that is because police have looked at certain neighborhoods and said, look, there's a deterioration of this neighborhood. We have to create an environment in that neighborhood where law-abiding people feel free to have a block party. And believe me, they're not going to do that if criminals have overrun that block. But people aren't going to have a block party if it's overrun with A, misdemeanors or E, felony perpetrators. They're just not going to have that block party. And so, yes, sometimes we have to, I think, enforce lower-level laws in order to realize a benefit in terms of serious violent crime. And one might say that that's crazy or wrong, except that it looks like it worked.
Let me tell you what's not smart policing. What's not smart policing is that New York City last year stopped 575,000 people on the streets of New York City. 575,000, more than 500,000 people, the majority of whom were young Black and Latino men. Now that might be smart policing if the results of those stops and the results of the frisks resulted in actual criminality finding, right? You actually found a weapon. You actually found drugs. You actually found something that resulted in an arrest for a crime. So here's what's not smart policing. You stopped over 500,000 people in New York City last year, and what was found was 0.5% of those stops resulted in the confiscation of a weapon. And by the way, it was more likely if you stopped a white person that you would find a weapon than if you stopped a person of color. What's not smart policing is that 522,000 of those stops were of Black and Latino men, and only 53,000 were of whites. That's not smart policing. What's not smart policing is to put your resources out into the community to stop 575,000 people last year, and only 6% of that entire number result in any kind of arrest at all. Not only is it not smart policing, not only is it a bad use of resources, it undermines the very credibility of the police department. It erodes whatever trust and relationship is left between communities that are being policed in that way and the police that are sworn to serve and represent them. And it erodes the entire foundation, in my opinion, of the police department and the criminal justice system. That's not smart policing.
Yeah. Let me say, you understand that I'm not speaking as a representative of my office. I'm speaking just for myself. Let me say this. The points that Robin raises are very important points. And in fact, the police commissioner in New York, Ray Kelly, recently announced that he's going to change the policy with respect to stop and frisk in New York. Now, let me tell you what he's proposed to do, and then we can discuss whether that might make a difference. And certainly, I would agree with the implication of what Robin says is, I mean, he announced this after he got a bad decision in a lawsuit. I mean, right after he got a bad decision in a lawsuit. So, but you know, that's why lawyers are good things. Sometimes lawyers bring about positive change. Those of you who are thinking of, or are either in law school or thinking of going to law school, you know, that's a good process. All right, so here's what's going to happen. When a police officer stops and what they call it now, stop, question, and frisk, stop, questions, and frisks someone, they're supposed to fill out a form. Well, what good does that do? It's only as good as the accuracy of the information in that form, and it's only as worthwhile as the person reviewing that form, the vigilance of the person reviewing the form. So what the police commissioner announced is that someone at the level of captain is going to have to review every one of those forms and do an audit. Well, that still might not impress you. You know, the problem is some of these forms simply say furtive behavior. You know, what was the justification for the stop, question, and frisk? Furtive behavior. Well, that really doesn't tell you whether that was a legitimate stop, question, and frisk or not. I mean, it may have been, it may not have been, but there's no way you can look at those words and decide, even if that's truthful, whether it rises to the legal level at which a stop, question, and frisk is appropriate. So this is to me the most significant part. You may know that there's something in New York called CompStat. CompStat is widely credited for being one of the most powerful smart policing tools and has been copied not just throughout the country in the criminal justice system, it's been copied in private industry, I mean in all kinds of areas. And the idea is and I've seen these CompStat meetings. In police headquarters, the chief of the department stands at the front and has the precinct commander on the other end of the room with everybody of importance in between them. And they project on the wall map. And he says, there were 3 robberies at that street corner in the last 2 weeks. What are you doing to keep that street corner safe? Or, this is a good one. They say, there's a guy who's committed 3 robberies, has been identified in a photo array, and you have his name. What efforts have you made to arrest that suspect? And the police precinct commander says, well, you know, I have people working overtime on that, and the chief stops him and says, I sent out 2 guys and they arrested him yesterday. Why couldn't you do that? It's really an attempt to hold police officers, ranking police officers responsible, and sometimes, frankly, to use embarrassment to make sure they're doing their job. Well, what Police Commissioner Kelly has said is he's now going to submit the audits of those stop and frisks, which are now available online, by the way, to anybody. And they're going to be included in CompStat. Now, if that really happens, I guarantee you, overnight, abuses will drop. Because if the chief of the department is really willing to do a real audit of those forms and is really willing to put the feet to the fire of any commanding officer who is not enforcing the law with respect to stop, question, and frisk, those things will change overnight. Also, one other nice reform, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which is outside of the police department auspices, has been given new powers now. So that if there is a civilian complaint about an improper stop and frisk, they now have the powers to prosecute that case rather than turn it over to the police department for internal resolution. And the police department, according to the commissioner, is now developing a statistical model so that they can identify police officers who are outliers in terms of